Hey there. Ready for another deep dive? This one's pretty intense. It's a case from the Philippine Supreme Court that went totally viral, and it asks a really, really tough question. Can someone who was a victim of exploitation, can they become the exploiter?
Yeah, it really makes you think about justice and accountability in a whole new way.
So the case is about these two women, Candy and Nikki, and they were found guilty of qualified trafficking in persons back in 2011.
Wow.
Yeah. And get this, they were sentenced to life in prison and a P2000 fine each.
Each.
Each. It's gone viral because they actually claimed they were victims too.
Ah, so they were basically saying because they'd been exploited, it was okay for them to do the same.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get into all of that, let's lay out what actually happened.
Okay, so the official name of this case is GR No 223042, and the Supreme Court decided it on October 6, 2021. Basically, Candy and Nikki were accused of violating Republic Act No. 9208. That's the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003.
Okay, so what exactly did they do?
Well, along with two other people who are still out there, they were accused of recruiting, transporting, and managing 8 women and 1 man for exploitation.
Oh, wow.
And 7 of those people were minors.
Ugh, that's awful. Where did this all happen?
This all took place in Cebu City back in November of 2008. And to make their case, the prosecution relied a lot on the testimonies of 3 of the victims, the ones who were minors.
I can't imagine how hard it must have been for them to come forward.
Yeah, it must have taken so much courage. And in their testimonies, they described how Candy and Nikki lured them, promising them way more money if they went to Cebu.
Oh, typical.
Right. And then they even paid for the travel, told them what to say if anyone asked questions, and even gave them a preview of what the work would be like. Prostitution, bar fines, the whole thing.
Sounds pretty grim.
Ah.
So what was Candy and Nikki's defense?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Instead of denying everything, they said that they were victims of prostitution, too. Yeah. They claimed they just went along to Cebu with everyone else, never forced anybody to go. They said there were these other people, they didn't name names, who were the real recruiters.
So it's their word against the victims?
Kinda, yeah. But the lower court really looked at all the evidence, and they ended up siding with the prosecution. Found Candy and Nikki guilty of qualified trafficking.
And that's what led to those long sentences, right?
Yeah. The judge pointed to the fact that the victims' stories were really believable, and also that Candy and Nikki were part of this whole system for recruiting and transporting these people. The fact that there were multiple victims and that a lot of them were underage, that made the crime much more serious in the eyes of the law. And that's why the judge gave them those life sentences.
Makes sense. So what happened next? Did they accept the decision?
Nope, not at all. They appealed. First to the Court of Appeals, but the Court of Appeals upheld the lower court's decision.
So they were out of options.
Well, they had one more option. They went all the way to the Supreme Court, hoping they'd see things differently.
What were their arguments to the Supreme Court? What were they trying to prove?
So they had a few key points. First, they questioned if their arrest was even legal, said it was unlawful. Then they argued the charges against them just weren't strong enough. And then, get this, they brought up this idea of attempted trafficking.
Attempted trafficking? What does that even mean?
Okay, so at the time, attempted trafficking wasn't actually a crime in the Philippines.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So if they could get the court to agree that what they did was attempted trafficking, the whole case could fall apart.
That's pretty clever. So did it work? Did the Supreme Court side with them?
No. The Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Lazaro Javier, they denied the appeal, upheld the convictions. But here's where it gets really interesting, especially if you're into, the why behind legal decisions.
I am all ears. Tell me everything.
Okay, so one of the biggest things the Supreme Court said was about consent. They were super clear that consent doesn't actually matter in trafficking cases when you're talking about minors.
So even if the minors had said, yeah, we wanted to go to Cebu, it wouldn't have mattered.
Exactly, because the law sees minors as, inherently vulnerable. And they need protection. And this is where the court's decision gets really thought-provoking. They said, look, it's tragic, but it happens. Sometimes people who were exploited, they end up becoming exploiters themselves.
Yeah, that's incredibly sad. But I can see how, the trauma of that experience could lead someone down that path.
It's like this horrible cycle. And the court basically said, the cycle has to be broken. And to do that, everyone involved needs to be held accountable, no matter what they've been through in the past.
That's a strong statement. Are you saying they completely disregarded the fact that Candy and Nikki might have been victims too?
It's complicated. They acknowledge that it's complicated. But in the end, they said past victimhood doesn't automatically erase present wrongdoing. They wanted justice for the current victims, regardless of what the perpetrators might have experienced before.
Man, this is definitely making me think. It's like, who's the victim and who's the perpetrator? It's all blurred.
Totally. And it brings up this huge question. What does real accountability even look like in situations like this? We can talk more about that in a bit, but I'm curious, what are your first reactions to all of this? What stands out to you?
Yeah, a lot of people are struggling with this whole, victim becomes the victimizer thing. It's definitely not easy to wrap your head around.
It really makes you question everything. But going back to the Supreme Court's ruling, they were super adamant that consent doesn't matter in these cases, especially when minors are involved. Why was that so important for them?
Well, minors are seen as super vulnerable under the law. Like, they don't always understand what they're getting into, especially in situations like this.
So even if they say, hey, I wanted to do this, the law still protects them.
Pretty much, yeah. It's about recognizing that they might not truly get the consequences. And this actually falls in line with international agreements the Philippines has signed on to, like the Palermo Protocol.
The Palermo Protocol. Yeah. It's all about preventing and fighting human trafficking, especially when it comes to women and children. So it shows you how seriously the Philippines takes this issue.
Interesting. So this case, it kind of reflects those global commitments, right? But what I find really interesting is that the court said just the intent to traffic is enough for a conviction, even if the victims never actually, engaged in prostitution. Can you explain that a little?
Yeah, that's definitely a point that confuses people. Because with most crimes, you have to actually do the thing to be convicted.
Right.
Like for robbery, you have to actually take something for it to count. But with trafficking, it's different. It's more about the process of exploitation, the steps leading up to it, not just the end result.
So it's like they're trying to stop it before it even begins.
You got it. It lets law enforcement step in before the actual exploitation happens, which is a huge shift from how we usually think about criminal law.
I see. But that brings up another question. If the exploitation hasn't actually happened, how do you prove intent? What are investigators looking at?
Well, it gets a little tricky there. They rely on things like witness statements, text messages, emails, phone records, financial transactions, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Anything that shows a pattern of behavior, like a puzzle, they have to put all the pieces together.
Makes sense. It makes me wonder about Candy and Nikki's history, though. If they were victims themselves, did that, play a role in what they did? Could those experiences have shaped their choices?
Yeah.
Even if they weren't aware of it?
That takes us right back to that ethical dilemma we talked about earlier. It makes us face this really uncomfortable truth that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator, it gets blurry.
It's like the cycle just keeps repeating itself, fueled by the very people who were once hurt by it.
Exactly. And that's why this case has sparked so much discussion. It forces us to think about accountability, what it means to rehabilitate someone, and the long-term effects of trauma.
Those as just regular people, how do we even process all of this? What does it mean for us?
I think it starts with education. We got to understand all the factors involved here. Trauma can affect people in ways we can't even imagine, and sometimes, sadly, that means they repeat the abuse they've suffered.
Like a messed up way of coping, using the only tools they know.
Yeah, in a way, but it's a way of coping that ultimately hurts everyone involved.
This is a lot to take in. It's hard to hear about this and not feel the weight of it all. The real people behind this legal case.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some abstract idea. Trafficking has real consequences, and it's happening all around us. The Philippines is not immune to it.
It's scary to think it could be happening right in front of us and we wouldn't even know. What are some signs that someone might be a victim, even if they don't realize it themselves?
That's a great question. The answer isn't always obvious. But look for people who seem controlled by someone else, especially if they're young.
Oh, yeah.
Like if they never seem to be alone, they're scared to talk, or their stories don't add up.
Yeah. Or what if they move around a lot?
Yeah.
Or they seem really isolated from their family and friends.
Those are definitely red flags, too. And of course, if you ever see anyone being paid for sex, especially if they're underage, report it right away.
Okay, so be aware, but not, paranoid. How do we find that balance?
I think it comes down to trusting your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to speak up. You could literally save someone's life.
Wow. That's powerful.
And remember, there are ways to report this stuff anonymously, too, if you're worried.
This is definitely eye-opening. We can't just sit back and do nothing.
We got to educate ourselves and be ready to act. The more we understand about this, the better we can protect ourselves and our communities.
This whole conversation has been really thought-provoking, I have to say.
That's what we like to hear. But there's still one more piece of the puzzle we got to talk about. That ethical question of holding victims accountable when they become perpetrators.
Yeah, that's been on my mind this whole time. How do we balance compassion with making sure people are held responsible for their actions?
That's exactly what we're going to dive into next.
So we've covered what happened in this case and how the Supreme Court ruled, but the big question is, can we and should we hold victims accountable when they become the perpetrators?
Man, it really makes you think about justice, rehabilitation, even just human nature.
I mean, on the one hand, you feel for these people, right? They've been through horrible things. You want to believe in second chances,
Yeah.
that people can heal.
Yeah, totally. We can't forget that trauma can have a huge impact on someone's choices, even if we don't always understand it.
But at the same time, they're hurting other people, continuing that cycle of exploitation that they were caught in.
That's the dilemma. Compassion versus accountability. Where's the line? And in this case, the Supreme Court, they definitely landed on the side of accountability.
They didn't let Candy and Nikki off the hook just because they might have been victims in the past.
Nope. Their reasoning was, to break the cycle, you have to hold everyone responsible, no matter what. Because if we just let victims become victimizers without any consequences, we're basically saying it's okay for the harm to continue.
Yeah, it's a tough stance. But I get it. If you look the other way, it just creates more victims.
And to be clear, I don't think accountability always means, like, harsh punishment. It can mean therapy, rehab, support systems, things that help them deal with the root causes of their behavior.
So we're holding them responsible, but also recognizing that they might need help to break free.
Exactly. It's finding that balance, recognizing both the harm they've caused and their potential to change.
Honestly, it's hard to imagine being through something so traumatic and then turning around and doing that to someone else.
Yeah, it seems backwards, doesn't it? But trauma can show up in so many ways. Sometimes, replicating the abuse, it becomes a coping mechanism, like a messed up way of trying to regain control.
So they could be justifying it to themselves as like a survival tactic.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But whatever the reason, we have to step in and break the cycle.
This is leaving me with so much to think about. Human behavior is complicated. So how can we approach these situations? How do we balance compassion with accountability?
It starts with knowledge. The more we know about trauma, about how exploitation works, about human behavior in general, the better we can respond.
We can't just like label people good or bad and call it a day.
Exactly. There are so many gray areas. We need to push for systems that address the crime and the stuff that leads to it, support organizations that offer therapy, legal help, and help survivors rebuild their lives.
Attack the problem from all sides.
There's no easy solution. It takes all of us working together, law enforcement, social services, regular people.
So what can we do, like right now, to make a difference?
Educate yourself. Learn the science of trafficking. Find out what resources are available in your community. Support organizations that are fighting this. Even small things like spreading awareness or donating, it all helps.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes.
Yeah.
We can't just listen to this and move on. We have to do something.
Couldn't agree more. This isn't just about laws and punishment. It's about our shared humanity. It's about creating a world where everyone can heal and thrive.
I think that's the perfect way to wrap this up. If you want to learn more, hit that subscribe button and check out the links in the show notes.
And share this with everyone you know. The more people we reach, the bigger the impact.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.